Welcome everyone to B-Sides I'm The Cavalry track. This talk is entitled Why Journalists and Hackers Need Each Other, a panel discussion with infosec reporters. We're going to make a couple quick announcements. One, please silence your cell phones. We really do need those to be silent in order for you to be able to hear the presenters. We are live streaming as well, so we really appreciate that. Two, if you do have any questions, just go ahead and raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone to you. If I somehow don't get there in time, the panelists will try and repeat your question, but I'll try and get there as soon as possible. I would like to go ahead and thank our Inner Circle sponsors who make this conference possible. That includes Critical Stack and Valley Mail, as well as many other sponsors, including the seller sponsors, Amazon, Cylance, and Robinhood. So thank you all for that, and thank you all to the volunteers that help make this happen every year. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to our presenters. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks everyone for coming out. My name is Sean Lyngaas. I am a reporter for a publication called Cyberscoop. I'm going to introduce the other panelists in short order. Before I do that, I want to just take a quick poll of the room. How many of you on a regular basis for your work interact with journalists? How many of you wish you interacted more with journalists? What about less? Yeah, that's good. All right, so the genesis of this panel is very simple. The fact that we need to have an open dialogue with security researchers to do our job well. And for those of us who are committed to learning the tools of the trade and really investing themselves in reporting on InfoSec, as long as we act in good faith, we feel like there should be open interaction. And the more we talk to you, the better our stories get, and hopefully the better informed the community gets. So that was sort of the impetus behind the panel. I'm going to introduce everyone real quick and ask them to sort of explain why they're here briefly, why they wanted to participate, and then give an example of how in their reporting sort of expectations of the non-journalists differed from reality and how they went about their reporting. So from my right, all the way across the stage, we have Lily Hay Newman from Wired, Kim Zetter, who's a freelance journalist and who wrote the book on Stuxnet, and Joe Cox, who is with Motherboard and does a lot of reporting on privacy as well. And so Lily, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, hey everyone, I'm Lily. I wanted to participate in this panel because I noticed that there's a lot I want to know from the community and from sources all the time. That's my whole job. But there's also a lot that people seem to want to know from me, which has kind of been surprising to me, that people say, oh, do you know someone at that company? Like, that would be really helpful. Or maybe we could go through the PR team to try to find out more about, this thing that I'm trying to disclose to the company, or, I would never be able to do that. Or, oh, do you know the researchers at this research team at this university? Because I felt kind of weird. We're kind of competitors. I didn't want to approach them, but maybe you could ask them what they think about my paper, or I'll just do that. And they're like, whoa, that's so awesome. Like, I always wanted to know what this person thought about our work, or all these connections and interactions that I never would have thought of. So I thought it was a really cool idea to do this panel and talk more about what you guys are experiencing and what the community feels about it.
Great. Okay.
So I guess where a journalist can help you is sometimes someone will come to me and they discover something, or they think they've discovered something, but they don't really know. And so I, as a journalist, can actually help them determine whether or not that's true. I can vet it against the company. I can vet it against other researchers. I know that there are researchers who they've told me that they come to me before they do interviews with other reporters because they don't know what they have to.
Sounds good, Kim.
They don't know what they have to include when they talk to reporters. And so they'll start to give me stuff that doesn't matter at all, and I'll say, come on, guys, let's get to the important stuff, cut out all the technical stuff, or, okay, now give me the technical details or something like that. And they've said that, these are also PR people who are with the researchers who tell me that they sit there and they take notes, and then they figure out how they're going to present it formally, either in a press release or in a bug or in a blog post, or then open it up for general interviews. I didn't know that for a long time, that that's what they were doing. And at first I was kind of annoyed. But actually I'm glad that they want to communicate better. And so, I mean, journalists don't have the time necessarily to help you with your research and your stories, but they can be a sounding board to tell you, for example, oh, that's really old. We've seen that a decade ago, especially for new people who are just doing research and they don't understand, they don't have the context of all the back history. So that's one of the services that you can do, I guess.
Hey, yeah, so over the past couple of years, I've probably been doing panels similar to this at RSA or BSides Dublin was another one. And the main motivation behind them is that hackers and journalists can do stuff together for the greater good. I mean, for the majority of my sources, they're criminals or independent researchers who aren't people who have the backing of a PR team. So if a teenage hacker comes to me, they're probably not going to be very experienced with talking to a journalist. And as for the first question on, expectations, one will be, hey, I put this data up on Alphabet or some other Torhin service. Can you please link to the listing so people will come and look at it? Because clearly sources have motivations, and I have mine as well, which is publishing something that hasn't been done before. And you have to explain that there's a balance between, yes, I still want to cover this data breach because, the company should be aware, users should be aware, and it's just a general public interest story, but I can't help you sell your data dump. So it's sort of explaining that dynamic, and obviously not just that specific example, but more generally this balance between how we can work together to do something that is actually beneficial is the reason I'm talking at these sorts of things.
Great. And there's sort of a natural tension between journalists who want to publish information based on our reporting and people sometimes in the security community who want to keep the name of a victim organization that was breached private or not disclose, or want to walk up to that line of disclosure that we're willing to cross. So how do each of you navigate that tension in your sort of day-to-day work? Whoever wants.
You had a good one, didn't you?
We argued about this, I think. So I understand if you have an NDA and you can't disclose the client, or if you're a researcher and you found a vulnerability in someone else's system and your PR people don't want to expose who they are. I understand those kinds of relationships. But what I try to explain to people is that, first of all, readers' eyes glaze over stories that don't include details. They want those dig down deep details that actually help them to put it into context. And if you're, let's say, the security person in a chemical plant, and all of these hacks are happening in the critical infrastructure, but they haven't happened to one of your competitors yet, then what you're going to hear from your boss when you try and go to him to increase the budget is, why? Show me why this is important. Or they'll think, none of our competitors are being hacked, none of our competitors are spending this money on it, why should I? And so actually publicizing the name of a victim actually puts that on the map for all of those executives who don't think that they in particular have a problem. So I think the naming is important. I think the naming is important also because then people can ask that company what happened and get more details. When you go to conferences, if you don't know who it is, then you're not going to get more information. We have this information sharing thing like with the government, and we all know that it's not perfect. And there are still a lot of people who don't know what's going on in attacks. What you get are the IOCs and nothing beyond that. And so I think that if we want to, as a community, to have more of that information sharing, then less shaming maybe, and then that won't make people hesitant to name themselves. But I mean, everyone is in the same boat in terms of being vulnerable, and I think it helps.
Right. I think there's one person shaming, another is transparency. Like in naming the victim, I mean, how are we going to change behavior and boost security without naming who was hacked? It's a delicate dance, but I think it's one that we're obviously going to be biased towards more disclosure of that. And then coming to the table with researchers who may not feel exactly that way, but understand where we're coming from is helpful for everyone.
Should we address what, like, the elephant in the room? So there was a story, obviously, of the one in Saudi Arabia, and when a journalist published the name of that company, he received a lot of criticism of that and a lot of flack. I would have published the name as well if I had gotten it. And I think in that case, it was particularly important to name it because when the hack was first publicized, there was a media outlet that published the wrong name. Without vetting it. And so I thought that it was important that this researcher or that this journalist who, when he did discover it, sets the record straight. And by the way, those stories that have the errors stay online. So when someone does a Google search of what happened, they alight on that story and they still see that the wrong company's name in it. So at the very least, to be able to have something else in a Google search that actually says what the name is helpful.
And I think it's useful to just set up what everyone's incentives or motivations are. Like Joe was saying before, in the case of trying to find out who a victim is because it's in the public interest or it provides context and details that help readers understand more about the situation, it's like journalist's job is to find out as much information as possible and publish it. If your job is to try to keep that information from getting out, okay, that's your job, but it doesn't change what the journalist's job is. So the journalist is going to try to find a way, a different source or a way around you. And so, that may be frustrating, but it's not surprising. It's the nature of the situation. So sometimes I think it's helpful to just have a refresher of that, where everyone stands, because it's not personal or it's not about one person's company. It's just the whole point of a journalist's job. And again, if your job is to try to keep something from getting out because you think that's important in a certain way, then that's your prerogative,
Right.
I mean, I guess just very generally, and this is more of a hypothetical, but the only time, really, very generally speaking, a journalist is not going to, name a victim or an organization or something like that is when naming them would disproportionately cause harm. So, for example, I've done a lot of work on spouseware, which is physical access malware used against people in abusive relationships. We don't go around doxing people who have been, sexually assaulted and malware put on their devices. Naming a company can be somewhat different. Of course, if there was a genuine risk of life, the journalist would consider that. But I can't immediately think of a case where if you name a company, it's going to cause some real harm. It may cause share damage and financial issues, which of course you would bear in mind, but it's not going to necessarily stop you from publishing something if it's true and if it's in the public interest.
What about bearing in mind how an adversary, a hacking group or what have you, would change its tactics if you publish the information? Sometimes we get grief from researchers who say, oh, well, you may think this is newsworthy, but if you put this out there, then it's make it harder for us to protect potential victims. I mean, how much of that has to factor into what you do?
I don't have an exact example for that, but one just recently was that the anonymous message board 8chan has lost its Cloudflare support, its domain registrar, that sort of thing. There's a mirror currently online, an unofficial one set up on a sort of quote-unquote dark web service, one of these various decentralized services. We decided not to name that specific one, even though, yeah, sure, you could go Google it, you could go figure it out, but we don't want to provide a step-by-step guide for people to find this version of the website. And I imagine you can make the same argument for, well, we're not going to do a how-to of how APT-free can go break into this specific system or something like that. When you do get to a certain granular level of detail, you may need to be more careful of the sort of information that you're putting out there. With the Edward Snowden documents, I would personally have a lot of issue publishing individual selectors for some of the things, because you may then be identifying targets or something like that. So the more granular you get, I think you have to be even more careful about what you're actually going to publish.
Yeah. Speaking of doxing, you mentioned doxing, Joe, and I'm wondering if there should be a voluntary infosec journalist code of conduct where it's not complicated, it's basic things that we all say we're not doing. I mean, maybe we don't have to say it, but Where this is coming from is I get a little bit upset when someone who, I'm not going to name any names, but people, someone does dox someone, a journalist out there does dox a researcher, and then there's an uproar, and, oh, see, this is how it is with journalists, and I think that sort of behavior obviously needs to be kept, ostracized and put out. And there's other basic things that we don't do, and you don't have to be really righteous not to do them. It's just common sense. So we do your job. You're not a horrible person. You don't do certain things. But should there be like a document out there where people who are less familiar with what we do say, okay, well, these people are part of the accepted community of infosec reporters who will not do these things or who will do these things. Is that worth even pursuing?
I don't like the idea of some sort of repository or document listing the good and the bad journalists.
No, not by name. Just saying it's sort of a voluntary code of conduct.
Dox the doxers.
I see what you mean. Very generally speaking, there can be some agreed upon rules, such as you're not going to, dox a victim of abuse or something like that. But there is so much variety in our occupation, which is why it's so important that when you do have information, it's preferable that you go to a journalist their work, you follow, you've seen what they've done before, and maybe you've seen how they've treated a similar subject before, so then you have some sort of expectation of how they're going to handle it. I know people, of course, who they could have been my sources, but maybe I'm friends with them, so it's not appropriate for them to come to me. They'll go to a journalist, and then they may get screwed over. But to actually answer the question, it's so varied that I think it would be difficult, and even beyond a logistical way of actually making a document like that.
But I have a question.
There are codes of ethics, though.
Right.
True.
And I was going to say, in what ways do you guys feel like standard journalistic best practices are not enough for the special situations of InfoSec? I'm just curious what you guys think, because I tend to try to, in my own reporting and making my own decisions, just try to go back to like very basic tenets of what have you agreed upon with the source? What have they said? Are the parameters of their willingness to work with you or not? Or as Joe was saying, like what is the potential for a danger or harm to either a source or sort of another party that is brought into the story. So I'm curious, I'm not saying there aren't, specific things, but that's what I tend to try to use is just the very sort of most basic foundational ways of doing all journalism. That's kind of what I try to think about.
There is sort of a different approach that you take to someone who is a professional spokesperson, right? Who is trained to work with journalists, and there's a different approach that you take to people who actually don't have any experience talking to reporters. If I'm talking to a PR person, I'm not going to lay down the ground rules to them. I try to do that when I talk with someone who's not used to working with journalists. When they start to say something's off the record, I stop them and I say, or they say something on background. I know that the general public has a different view of what on background means than what journalists understand it to mean. And that, I think, creates a lot of pain when it turns out that you've told a journalist something and you think on background actually means that you're not going to get quoted. And that's not true. So I try to lay out the rules. As soon as someone uses one of those buzzwords, I stop them and I ask them, what do you mean by that? Because I just want to make sure that we both understand what that means. And then it turns out that they don't actually know, and so we go through them, and I'll explain all three of them on the record, off the record, on background, or on deep background. And sometimes even with PR people love to say, we're just going to tell you this on background. On background means you can use it. But what they actually mean by that is, just as, us girls, we're going to tell you something so you understand what it means, but we don't want you actually using it. So even with PR people, you have to stop them and say, okay, this is... So I consider that part of the ethics of journalism. And if someone comes back to me afterwards, if I did an interview recently with a guy who, he was surprised when I called him, but he was surprised that it was me calling him. And that sort of put him off guard. And he started talking to me, and then we get off the phone and he texts me and he says, can we make that all off the record? And I said no. But I did do a fact check with him, so he was comfortable afterwards what I was using and that I got the facts right.
Yeah.
We have questions.
So I want to. We're going to do questions at the end, but I will make an exception for Josh. Once
It's his panel. It's his track.
I'm kind of the moderator, so I don't want to like talk too much. But I had just a comment on what Lily said about how do you approach it slightly differently with infosec. I mean, simply put, if it's a security researcher whose trust you're trying to gain and who maybe doesn't have a lot of experience, be a little bit kind of, I'd say, gentler with the person instead of whereas if we're going into a press conference with a DOJ or DHS official, it's it's a knife fight. We're going throwing questions out. I mean, there's no holds bars. I mean,
exactly.
You're there to grill them.
Right.
I'm not really necessarily all the time here to grill people who have come to me with a discovery, a vulnerability, or whatever. Something, a 0 day or something. So it's a little bit of a different treatment. I mean, you want to vet, you want to ask questions, you want to ask hard questions, but you're not like, this isn't taxpayers' dollars that you're asking about and how they're being spent. But go ahead, Jay.
I did not want to ruin your flow. It's just I saw some people gasp with your definitions on background.
Oh, yeah.
Could someone give the canonical definitions for each of those categories? Because most people in here have not
I'm
been
afraid to
media
give
trained.
them because some other journalists will say, well, no, that's not the definition we use.
Well, yeah, so this is what I kind of meant about everything is a little bit wonky and a little bit different. So really, really generally speaking, on the record is your name will be used, you can be quoted, background, typically Silicon Valley companies and tech companies like to do it on background, whereas you can paraphrase what we've said and you can attribute it to, say, Microsoft, but you don't name the person who said it. Deep background.
It's not just paraphrasing. You can put it in quotes. You can quote you can quote what they said, but you just can't attribute it to them
But
by
they
name.
don't always. They don't usually mean that when they say.
Yeah,
But in government, when they say on background, it's usually it
We're
could
just
be
gonna give you some
administration
information.
official.
Right.
You don't even identify the organization often. Sometimes you do. So
And this is why you lay out the terms, especially when I brought up the teenage hacker example earlier. I don't really talk on background with teenage hacker. It's either on the record or off typically, but using their handle. But these terms are garbage and they mean pretty much nothing a lot of the time.
Wait, keep
so I
going.
sometimes just go
Do
and
deep background.
right. Well, usually I would just say this means I can quote you, but I'm only going to use your hacker handle or something like that. I'll just get super explicit. Anyway, back to the list.
Well, can I?
Yes. Go ahead. No, please.
So background, you can, and this is my use of background. Again, it's going to vary, so that's why you want to set the terms. Background means that you can quote someone, the full words of what they said, but you wouldn't name them. And you would figure out how to attribute them. Do you want to be attributed as an FBI official or, a government official, whatever? Deep background, can quote them, all of that, but you're going to move the attribution further away. So instead of saying an FBI official, you're going to say someone with knowledge of the situation. You want to move them out of the agency so that the pool of people that could possibly be the source is much broader and wider.
yeah, sometimes it's about protecting the source rather than
Yes.
anything else.
But I do say to people, sometimes they don't want to be identified at all, and they want that deep background. And I say to them, but a reader reading this story is going to want to know why you are in a position to know this information. So it's helpful for me and it's helpful for the reader if I can actually say you're an FBI official. That shows them how close you are to the information and that you're not abusing the anonymous source designation.
I would just say that touches on, and then obviously off the record is just, whatever. But
There is another thing on off the record, though.
do you want to say that and then I'll say my thing? No.
Interrupt you.
No.
It just struck me.
Okay. I mean, I just think it touches on two things, which is that there are two main priorities or obligations when it comes to a journalist, and that is protecting the anonymity of the source, if that's what the story involves, but there's also an obligation to the readers to be as transparent as possible of where this information came from. Like as Kim touched upon, we can just say, a source familiar with, and that may not be someone inside an exploit company, that may be someone who spoke to someone who then spoke to someone else from a rival exploit company or something like that, which muddies the water, doesn't make the story as good, and the reader has no idea about the veracity of the information. As long as it is not infringing on the anonymity or the protection of the source, the reader comes first. And I said that very, very carefully because obviously you say that and people are like, oh, you don't care about anonymous sources. No. If the anonymity is guaranteed and it's solid, the main obligation is then the reader and the transparency in the story itself and making it clear and fair to everyone.
Yeah.
This panel is all on the record, by the way.
Oh, great.
Wait.
What's that mean?
I agree that we are here to service the reader. And that's primary. The sources as well, because we can't do our job without sources. And so there's a balance there that you explain to sources what you need for the reader to trust the article and to trust what the information that you're giving you. The off-the-record thing. So this gets a little touchy because there are journalists that do this, and some people consider them unethical. If you tell a journalist that something is off the record, they're not supposed to be able to use that information. But you can use off the record information to then go obtain that information on the record somewhere else. So if a government official tells me something and they say, look, this is classified, I can't tell you this, but I'm going to tell you this off the record. And you need to use it. It's important, good information, but you can't use it because that person has told you off the record. But now you know where to start your search for information. And armed with that knowledge now, you can start asking around and saying, I heard about this situation, or I heard something about this, to someone else and say, can you tell me anything about it? And that's perfectly fine to do. There are journalists who operate on the edge of that in a kind of unethical way. But I'll leave it there. I only know circumstances where journalists have done something unethical.
Do you
But
want
I'll
to
leave
name
it.
any names?
No, I don't.
Well, and I also just want to note that, again, I just think it's about everyone understanding what everyone's job is and what their motivations are. The true off-the-record thing is don't tell a journalist, right? Like, if you really want to be sure you're off the record. So
What are you doing?
the reason I bring it up is just because, I think people get into all these confusions because they're forgetting like what we're talking about here, and yeah, please tell us everything. We don't want to be off the record. We don't want you to stay away. But yeah, I mean, I think if everyone could just keep in mind the parameters of the project here and the sort of collaboration, it would help there to be fewer surprises because nobody is trying to.
No one wants to piss off a source.
Right, exactly. And genuinely, because it is a collaborative effort. And I think, journalists feel, that positive building of something together when you work on a story with someone where everybody feels like a tough issue was well represented or, well explained, and the readers really benefited. So that's why I just bring that up, even though it's taboo, is because, everyone has power and control in these situations and can make the choices that are right for them.
So we're doing pretty well on time. There's going to be time for more questions, which are fun. I did want to ask Lily and Kim one thing, and here's my little intro anecdote to that. Preparing for Black Hat and DEF CON, I did not give my email to be distributed to PR professionals because they know how to find me. But I got a deluge of pitches asking to meet with executives, and about, 80-90% of them were offers to talk with male executives. And they were often actually coming from female PR professionals, which I don't know what to make of that. But the bottom line is that it got me thinking more about representing diverse voices in the community and who we quote, who we talk to, and of course that means we absolutely should have as many female infosec reporters as we can. So that's a long-winded way of introducing. Can you describe to the audience and to us what it's like to be a woman infosec reporter? How is it different than being a woman infosec security researcher, even though you're not? I mean, that's hard to answer, but how do you approach your job that way? How do you overcome bias and discrimination that you experience as a result of your gender? Take it away.
I was hoping Kim would start because you said something when we were preparing for this that I thought was really interesting about whether things have gotten better or worse.
So I've been at this for a while, and when my first DEF CON, I had started at PC World, and one of my colleagues had just come back from DEF CON, and he's describing this hacker conference. And I just thought this was brilliant. You know, a conference for hackers who actually go and have sessions, panel sessions talking about this. So I asked him to take me with him the following year. And I didn't know what to expect. And I walk into the Alexis Park Hotel, and I walk into the rooms. I know. Poor Alexis Park. We all miss it. And there were like 1,000 people in the room. And I would say 95% of them were men. And I didn't know how I was going to be treated or how people would react to me. And I was amazed at the amount of respect that I was given. And during those years of covering this, people were immensely respectful and helpful and helping me to get up to speed on this topic. I'm not a tech person by nature. I'm an English major. And I think that people didn't see that difference. What they saw was that I was really interested in the topic and eager to learn. That has changed over time. The more people that have gotten into InfoSec, the larger this has become, the more of a hot topic it's become. There are a lot of different people now in this community. And there is bias, there is dismissiveness, there is condescension. What can I say? People don't expect that I know anything. I tweeted this. I was at an event in DC a couple of months ago. I'm a speaker at the conference. We have a speaker's dinner. I'm sitting there at a table. A couple of men sit down. I'm talking to the one next to me. And the guy across from me comes from a security company, says to the guy next to me, "Oh, is this your wife?" And it's a speaker's dinner. So I think his assumption, though, regardless of the context of the situation, was always going to be that I'm not there for knowledge that I have or any expertise that I have. And I was telling Lily, I was bothered by how much I was bothered by that. I felt like I shouldn't have been bothered by it. And I was trying to brush it off, but as the dinner went on, I was getting more and more angry about it. But anyways, so I don't think that we've improved. I think as the community has gotten larger, it's gotten worse.
Yeah, I wonder if maybe that is because there are more women in the community and there is progress, and that therefore there's more of a pushback and it's sort of an active thing, and there's more tension and it's more on everyone's minds. But yeah, I definitely feel it also, and I feel that when a lot of your sources are men, I find that there's some difficulty with just navigating semi-social situations where you get some of your, best information and you're really just kind of hanging out with someone learning about what they're interested in or what they're working on. It's kind of some difficulty navigating those situations with ease. An example I always give is just that there's a real societal stigma against women buying men drinks, but journalists aren't really allowed to accept lots of free stuff from people. So generally what male journalists do is they just post up somewhere and they say, I'm buying, everybody come hang out, or, they ask a couple of sources to come and they buy all the drinks. But I find that sometimes there's a little bit of awkwardness about that when I'm trying to sort of host that type of like casual hangout with a few people, and it's like really small stuff like that you wouldn't necessarily think about. And I'm pretty willing to just kind of confidently try to do something and get everyone to go along with it, and I'll really try to put myself out there. But you push up against these societal rules or limitations or standards where suddenly you're like, wow, it's really hard to push back on this, and it's actually not fostering the situation that I wanted in order to be talking to people. So that's a big thing that I notice and think about a lot, and I think there's just a lot of background thought going into negotiating interactions that should be really, casual and straightforward. And I think many of my male colleagues in the field do not need to put in that thought.
There's another element to that, and that is especially since we're at Black Hat and BSides and DEF CON at Vegas, of course, and that is when it happened. I can't remember the last time it's happened, but a lot of companies used to host their events at the Shadow Bar. And I don't know if you're all familiar with the Shadow Bar, but there are naked women dancing behind screens. And so you're at a bar and you're in a professional setting and you're trying to do your job, and it is very sexualized environment. And so that's difficult to do. And I was also at a conference where I really wanted to engage with the people who were there after the conference, and we're all gathering after the conference, and they're talking about where to go, and they're going to go to a strip club. And so they didn't invite me. And I didn't know initially what was going on, but they were sort of kind of moving away from me to organize where they were going. And then I found out later that that's what had happened. So that kind of thing, I mean, we're trying to do our job, we're in professional settings, and I suppose a male reporter would have gone with them, or they would have invited him, but those are the kinds of things that we run up against in trying to do our job.
Yeah, and you see how like the choices there are really poor, because even if they do invite you to the strip club, then you're like at the strip club, and this has actually happened to me, and you're just like, okay, like kind of wanted to know like what you're working on or like what's new with you. So it's just like sometimes you're just between a rock and a hard place with, and I think there's that pushback in the community also, like, well, you wanted to be invited, there's that vibe. So it's pretty difficult to navigate. And basically, to summarize, I think that is the biggest thing that characterizes the experience for me, is just needing to do a lot of extra work in the background to make it seem like everything's just chill.
Great. Thanks for sharing your perspectives on that. We're going to go to the audience. If you have questions, you look wired and ready to just pepper us with questions. You don't feel free, if you want to identify yourself. Otherwise, no worries.
Hey, really interesting. Thanks for saying those words.
Where's the voice coming from?
Just got.
I see.
Oh, I'm back. Sorry. Speaking into the microphone wrong?
Yeah, just
No, you're
We
good.
just couldn't see
can't
you.
see you.
Not. Hello. Okay.
Go ahead, sir.
All right. I'm standing up. Hi. So I'm going to completely derail your super with the question that I was thinking about before, which is like, for me, there's a real dichotomy when it comes to reporting things to reporters, which is that, like, for me, if I want to get something out there, it's because I want people to be informed. And I really think there's something busted with this microphone. Am I just being cut off every now and then? I'm pointing at my mouth. Can you give me a different...
He's got you.
I can shout if you want, but I don't know whether that is allowed. Just talk? Okay. Sorry. So there's like a dichotomy of when I give things to reporters, because when I give things out, I want the public to be informed, especially since there's so much like confusion about what people should care about when it comes to security. And I find that like there's two possible routes that end up happening. One, the article ultimately ends up being really, really technical. And the result is that a reader who reads that doesn't really know how they should interpret the information. And the other outcome is that the article ends up being really sensationalist, and then the person ends up just really like worried existentially about something that may potentially be a very technical vulnerability that only affects, say, enterprise systems, for example. Is there anything that I can do to, I don't know, make it so that the things that are produced as a result of my work or just in general end up having people come away with the kind of information about, like, here's how much I should worry about this thing, and here's the effect that it's going to have on my life or something else in my life, instead of just like the headless chicken effect that we see so much in security.
I can take that.
Sure, before.
Yeah, so it's kind of what I mentioned earlier about choosing a journalist who you maybe follow, either on Twitter or some other way, and you're familiar with their work, who's going to present the information in a way that you think is going to be the best way to inform the public. The journalist may disagree, and they may do another thing, but for one example I have recently just did a very bread and butter story, very normal one, about how a Russian developed cryptographic standard had some potential flaws in it, and other members of a regulatory body took issue with that. And for us, the story was the geopolitical context around that and around this tension within the body between nation states. For us, that's the story. We weren't actually particularly invested in the super technical details of this cryptographic flaw. So we didn't go into detail on that. Some readers on Twitter especially were like, well, where's the technical details? We link to the white paper so people can go read that if they want. For us, for a more general audience, we're emphasizing that geopolitical angle. So it really, and if that had gone to, I don't know, a journalist at the Register or something, or maybe Kim, who's a lot more technical than me, maybe the article would have been more technical in nature, but it really does depend upon the journalist and the outlet. So I would just think about who you're going to give it to rather than the first journalist you think of in 5 seconds.
I think you're both quite technical.
Or you can give it to a couple of journalists.
Yeah.
I mean, you give it to the person who you know is going to do the technical story, and then also give it to someone who's going to do maybe the broader strokes. I mean, you see a story in CNN, right? And then you also see it done by an infosec reporter. And so the readers who want both or who want one or the other can get them.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing. Like, it's positive that there are choices about how what gets focused on, because there's a lot of parts to everything,
Next question.
All right, so my name is Klaus Homan of that same Twitter handle, because I'm not afraid of being doxxed. I can self-dox. But when you were talking about, and I'm going to dox him, Brian Krebs, before, you said he should be ostracized, and thereafter you left out mentioning by name, which does not ostracize. I was wondering why you did that.
Fair point. I was talking about ostracizing the behavior in general. I mean, I don't need to point fingers at a specific person. I just want to make it clear from how I and the people on the stage approach their profession in not doing that. I mean, look, he faced plenty of criticism for what you're referring to, I think. So I don't feel the need to personally, call anyone in particular out. I'm just talking about standards of professional behavior. So I actually think if you get too much into the back and forth, especially on Twitter, it's not a good use of your time. So that's my personal opinion.
Hi, I'm Stacy, and this is part comment, part question. So I'm sorry, I've already forgotten all of your name.
It's okay.
But the woman on my right mentioned having to do a lot of work in the background to make sure everything seems chill. Mm-hmm. That's called emotional labor, and it's a huge burden that women bear both in the workplace and in the home. And it's the invisible work of managing other people's feelings. And Google it, you'll go down a rabbit hole. But I just thought I'd throw this back out there. How big of a burden is that in your jobs? Is that something you see on a regular basis, or is that something that's happens now and then? Just kind of curious how pervasive it is.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's a huge burden. I also think of it as something called the third shift. So the first shift is your job. Second shift is tasks, like, laundry or, cleaning up trash at work, or, it can be in any context. And the third shift is thinking to do that, or thinking to approach someone, to plan for something in advance, or, and women generally are socialized to be more focused on the third shift. So I see that coming up, or the emotional labor, and I see that coming up in my job all the time with colleagues, with sources. I definitely notice that sources will tell me a lot of stuff about their personal lives, send me photos of their kids, and I welcome that, and I'm really down for it. But I notice that I receive it disproportionately, and I think it just has to do with societal expectations, and it can be good. For journalism, people feel more comfortable. You can remember things about their personal lives that they've told you and bring them back up as a way to, to make people feel more comfortable, and that you kind of remember them and you see them. So, I try to make the best of it and, use it in positive ways, which is genuine. But, it's also a crap ton of work.
I also want to say that, a lot of people in PR or at the spokespeople of organizations that we deal with and companies and things like that, a lot of them are women. But there are also, particularly in government, at government agencies where the spokespeople are men. And there's this entire relationship that they develop with male reporters, this very buddy relationship. And it's something that female journalists have to deal with constantly, and that you're left out of that. And so you are constantly calculating in terms of how you approach someone, how you get the information that you need, how you're going to be perceived, what you're going to be left out of, what you're going to be included in. It is a big part of the job, more than I think a lot of us ever really acknowledged for a long time. But it's there, yeah.
It's a great point. I mean, the buddy, but that we can kind of turn on the charm and be broy with another with a male spokesperson in a way that it's not available. So
can you keep talking about your experience as a male reporter too, just for parody? And I'm curious.
Just for parody, like you call it, not parody, like a joke. That parody. No, yeah, not with the DY. Okay. Experience as a male reporter. Well, I think what Lily said really hit home about the buying drink situation, where you can, oh yeah, I'm buying, let's talk, let's chat, and it's sort of, people don't think, give it a second thought, whereas it's a different dynamic there. What Kim just said really resonated too, about the ability of male reporters to just kind of get chummy and I don't know what the right analogy is, but talk sports and just be talk about, try to relate from a guy perspective, and then is there anything else in particular you're looking for?
Are there challenges?
Oh, yeah. Like what are your?
You find yourself only able to relate to them on certain levels, and they won't trust you with other kinds of information. Sorry for that.
No, it's okay. I mean, I don't know if Joe has thoughts.
I'm not sure how helpful this comment is, but some sources, because when we're doing a piece, we will work in a team. Of course, there are editors, there are journalists as well. Multiple people are behind every story. I can't say exactly the story right now, but there is a female protagonist who is a victim of some sort of abuse, and I'll leave it like that. And it was better that we hired a female photographer for that very particular context. And that's just something that is more appropriate for the story, easy to handle, and it just would feel very strange if I turned up. So it's better to delegate that work to someone more capable and able to do it.
Like I would say also that we're in trying to write more about these kinds of issues as a male reporter, you want to be very thoughtful about it. So I ask female friends, reporters, researchers for advice on how to start, talking about those things and not come off as a woke dude or an insensitive dude or whatever the vibe you don't want to give off is, and how it's the same reason, like when I spent a little time freelancing in West Africa, and I did a story on the LGBT community in Cote d'Ivoire where I was living, and I'm not gay, and I'm not from Cote d'Ivoire. So those are two things that I had to take a long time to try to understand and think in a different way about before I asked questions, before I opened my mouth. So I guess that's why I don't have a lot of that. Like, I'm trying to think more about it, and I think what my co-panelists said today is actually helping one my thought process.
I just also want to add, sorry, before we move on, I can't speak to it myself, but I just want to say that, trans and non-binary folks in the community and reporters all face a lot of challenges as well, and I think do a lot of important work trying to open up all of this and, change the paradigm. So
We have just about 4 minutes left.
Okay.
Thanks for presenting. The recent news on VLC and the follow-on VLC, the media player, and the follow-on reporting and the exposure of, I think, some assumptions around what type of vetting maybe MITRE and the CVE program is actually doing before they release CVEs. I think, are there any lessons learned on y'all's end as far as, do you fact-check these reporting systems? Are you assuming that the CVEs are vetted by MITRE, which I guess it wasn't, perhaps, as much as we think? Thank you.
So I'm not familiar with that particular case. I don't know if you are, but I will say, of course, we vet things of that nature. The CV scoring is an ongoing debate in the community, but
I tend to come to those pages last. Like, I kind of only look at it when I'm going to pull the link, or if I want to check against other materials that I've gathered or something. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't admit that, or maybe that's just me or something. But I don't find that I like really heavily rely on that stuff, because it's always coming from checking with sourcing or cross-referencing or something.
Right. So when you're talking about a CV score or CVSS, the severity of a vulnerability, the scale is very
arbitrary,
hit or miss.
Yeah.
So I do is just ask people who would know, okay, how serious is this? I mean, is that score indicative of it? So it's not a mathematical thing in terms of describing the severity of a vulnerability in a story.
Just super briefly, it highlights the importance of fact checking. No journalist likes to screw up. One I had was just in the wake of WannaCry. Two independent researchers spoke to me. They're not affiliated with each other at all, and they both said that they found a version of WannaCry without the kill switch. So I heard it from one very reputable cybersecurity company, Kaspersky. I then go to another researcher who's independently discovered it. That looks like a story. Turns out it was wrong, and we had to retract the story. And that is unfortunate. Ultimately, it falls down to the journalist who has to bear responsibility for that.
Yeah, but you've got two different people saying the same thing.
Yeah.
I thought that seemed solid.
And then I got very drunk after
It
them.
feels solid.
Because it sucks, right? But the journalist really has to be sure.
We should probably just, I know we don't have time, and you got a question, but the Bloomberg thing,
Okay, settle
Sorry
in,
to bring that
people.
up at the end of the panel when you're all leaving. But yeah, they say that they had 18 sources. We don't know who those sources are, so it's hard for us on the outside to weigh those and say, well, are they 18 bad sources, or are many of them actually good? And so the journalists aren't really responsible for that. I don't know. We don't have enough information to go on that. But if you solidly have 18 sources saying things, you had only 2, but there's a point where you reach where you say, okay, I vetted this enough and I've got to publish. And even then you can be wrong. So I'm not saying Bloomberg did vet, but I'm just saying.
Josh.
All right. There's a lot of interest in the room to keep going. So since we can go a little bit long because we don't have somebody immediately after you. But since this is the I Am The Cavalry track, and we are focused on public safety, human life, I want to shift back maybe somewhere in that vicinity. We like to say we want to raise the alarm without being alarmist, because we don't want to scare people away from life-saving medical devices. We also don't want a blind faith and trust in things that are indefensible and insecure. But there's that old paradigm that we've all been told, if it bleeds, it leads, right? For one of the axioms of coverage, even if it's not you, it might be your editor. And it's fair, right? If it bleeds, it leads. So what's the right tensions for us to carry around as we pitch stories or approach journalism so that we can have one of those things that catalyzes investigation and corrective action without being hyperbolic? It's kind of building off the question in the back. But also, there's a different trend where, so it's going to sound like a departure, but I'm going to triangulate. I probably know about 100 forever days that people tell me as their confessional during DEF CON. These are old school hackers. They'll grab me at DEF CON. They'll say, I found this thing. I can't tell anyone. It'll never get fixed, and a lot of people will get hurt. But now I'm seeing it's kind of like a business strategy to come up with a forever day and drop them to get coverage because it's sensationalist. So how do we navigate your motivational structure and your editors with the cavalry mission to raise the alarm without being alarmist, when there seems to be a trend maybe towards more people dropping very serious, very safety critical, unpatchable forever days and getting a lot of reward for that? Yeah. So how do we do our job and our mission in this room in light of the other motives?
Excellent question. I think during the prep call you were talking a bit about that. If you want to start.
What were we talking about?
Like disclosure, basically, and the process the journalists can play in that, I guess.
Oh, sorry, I'm trying a complete blank.
Just to clarify,
do you want me to take
those forever days, like whether it's an older school hacker, they'll take those to their grave, right? It's not about full disclosure. They just have decided those things are too risky. It only advantages the adversary. But now that that's softening.
It's an excellent question. I think the challenge for us as journalists in the media is maybe if one of us passes on it and says, "Oh well, first of all, none of us want to be in the business of trafficking and FUD and the ultimate allegation against a journalist, but not the ultimate one." But at the same time, if somebody comes to me with a vulnerability in medical, life-dependent medical equipment, and I think, well, that's scary, but that seems like overblown and scary to try to get clicks. And then I don't write about it, and somebody else from a reputable publication writes about it, and then somebody else. There's a cascade, and you're like, oh, well, why didn't we write about that? And maybe we're satisfied with our ethical decision, we feel good about ourselves, but there is a bit of a herd mentality in the way that people approach that. The only other thing I would say about the sort of balancing between motivating and scaring is that headlines are really hard, and we often don't write them. And how do you get people? You don't. This is what Kim was talking about in the prep. How do you don't want? There's so many boring headlines that you throw away because they're like, well, why would anyone read them and click on that?
I remember now.
At the same time, so there's so much tension wrapped up into that, and I think you're right. There is a bigger tendency these days of people to want to get that information out there for whatever their motivation is. People that won't take the forever days to their grave, and so that's more than ever. It's going to be more challenging to cover medical security things, pacemakers. People like, well, oh crap, look at this big recall. That's why I like calling folks like you, who when we do see that information, how do we put it into context? Help me, first of all, help lend credibility to what I'm writing about by including a quote from a credible MedSec expert, but also like grounded. The headline's going to be scream something, but like grounded in a little something high up in the story where you're like, okay, well, here's how to fix it or whatever. That's what my
one of the things that we were talking in the prep call is that impression that people are just publishing stories to get clicks. And you see that all the time on Twitter when people say that. And yes, there are publications that do that they're in the business of getting clicks. But when you're writing a story and you're going over the headline, the headlines, the editors that I work with, we collaborate on the headline. They will put some samples, some suggestions, and then I yay or nay, and we tweak them until we come up with a headline that I feel is representative of the story. That isn't always the case. I've worked with editors that really don't care. I've worked in places where you have someone who's not a journalist putting the headline on stories. And so you really have to weigh that at every outlet. It's all different. But in terms of what we were talking about in the call about the clicks and stuff, you want people to read the story. You don't want a boring headline or a headline that doesn't quite get the gist of it. And so you are balancing that between not making it sensational, but also exactly wanting readers to actually get the information. So.
And in terms of forever days, I think it is, to Josh's point, that journalists are just trying to manage whatever's going on. So if people are taking those to their grave, that's probably not the type of thing that a journalist would actively dig into and try to get the story on and try to reveal. But if it's going to come out anyway, if someone has decided that they're going to release it, then it becomes the thing that's more like what Sean was saying of, well, do I want to do it myself and try to make sure it's done right in a controlled way, or do I want to, leave it to others and because I don't want to participate in it? So you need to make that decision. And at the point where something's going to come out, that's the point where then we as a society are going to be forced to reckon with the truth of this thing or the reality of this vulnerability or this situation, whether we want to or not. So then journalists are kind of needed again to give people as much information as we can about that so that we can try to figure out something to do about that situation. And the last thing I'll say quickly is just that because there is so much news all the time and there is so much fatigue, I've written a few stories that about what I felt were essentially forever days, where as I was hearing about it, I was like, oh crap, this is never going to get fixed. And like, people didn't really read the story and didn't really care. And that doesn't mean, I mean, people who want to know and are on it, but it's like we're dealing with a lot of weird trends or sort of audience reactions to stuff that's really tough to manage, where you're like, well, I don't want to overhype it, but like, this is a really big deal, guys, and like, no one's reading this story, so like, do you not care? Or it's just really hard to manage everybody's interests and where their attention is.
One more, or are you?
I think we're just going to go with final words here. If you have any final parting
My
words.
only final words are thanks for coming out. Keep talking to us. Keep opening up the dialogue. Of course, we make mistakes. We're not up here trying to preach too much. It's just about transparency and learning from each other.
Who's buying at the bar?
Me.